Joining me now is Douglas Murray, Associate Editor of The Spectator and the best-selling author of The War on the West. Let's start with crime and punishment, Douglas. We have a legion of Soros-backed prosecutors in cities across America who are seen to be very soft on crime, but the man himself is unapologetic. George Soros wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in the last few days saying he'll continue to pour his considerable resources into backing what he calls reform prosecutors.
Yes. It's an extraordinary thing. It's one of the things about George Soros it's very hard to bring across is that he does sound at times just like a Bond supervillain. And it's not from nowhere that people have found themselves going into this sort of, hole of analysis about him because, he has extraordinary wealth. He has an extraordinarily strong ideology. And he has been able to run against whole cities, whole nations, actually, on the international stage. And what he's been doing in America, and one of the many things he's been doing in America, is backing what he calls reform-minded district attorneys. Now, these are people who believe in, for instance, bail reform, that they believe will, empty the American jails and will bring great justice to America. And in reality, bail reform, as it has been happening in countries across America, is not reducing crime. It is, as many people could have told him, accelerating crime. You see in major cities like New York, where the very liberal-minded DAs have arrived, they try to make things non-crimes that were crimes until yesterday. Serious crimes, shoplifting, car theft, all sorts of other things. You see the police totally demoralized, not just because they've had to have several years of everyone insisting that they're racist proto-murderers themselves, but because whenever they actually get a criminal, the criminal will be out within 24 hours, back on the streets. The New York Post showed this week there are people in New York who've been arrested up to 100 times and let out. So these sort of Soros-backed reforms they're not reducing crime. They're not making the country more equitable or more fair or anything like this. They're making cities far more dangerous than they need to be. It's exactly the opposite of the policy that was so famous during the Giuliani mayoralty in New York, the so-called broken windows policy, where you make sure that even the smallest crimes like a broken window are prevented and therefore the area becomes safer. It's exactly the opposite of that. It's actually making major crimes non-crimes. And as a result, crime as a whole is running wild.
Absolutely. It is the polar opposite to that policy with the polar opposite results. As you explained, the crime rate, particularly violent crime, is just soaring in some of these cities. Now, to a question we're going to be asking and talking about for many months to come, who's going to be the Republican presidential nominee in 2024? It looks like it'll be a two-horse race between Donald Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. This is interesting. A poll taken at CPAC on the weekend had Trump winning 69% to 24%, and the nearest third place getter was on 2%, Ted Cruz. But it's not going to be that easy for Donald Trump, is it, Douglas Murray? I mean, Ron DeSantis is a formidable politician.
He's a formidable politician, and here is one of many reasons why I think he's a more attractive candidate for the Republicans. Donald Trump brings significant baggage. I mean, we don't need to rehearse how much of it, but not the least of them is, of course, his reaction to the 2020 election. He is this looming figure, very popular with much of the Republican base, but he'll be approaching 80 by the time he's in the White House if he was re-elected again. He's certainly not in the first flush of youth. Ron DeSantis is almost half his age. And frankly, I mean, you can see a scenario where Ron DeSantis effectively got Trump's blessing and was able to pick up the Trump enthusiasts and other people, including the sort of swing voters in the US who Donald Trump, frankly, cannot attract. You can see a scenario where that could happen, but it would require Donald Trump to step out of the way. And I don't think anyone really thinks that's likely to happen. Donald Trump is perhaps the least likely person in the world to step out of the way. So it's very interesting seeing what maneuvers are going to happen in the coming weeks. I would expect that DeSantis, like all of the other Republicans who would like to run, is going to continue to keep his eye on Mar-a-Lago, because they all know, all the Republicans who can run and who may well be able to win the presidential election, which of course Donald Trump did not in 2020 and arguably could not in 2024. All of the Republicans who would like to run are effectively holding back because they know that whoever is first out of the traps will be massacred by Donald Trump. He will do all of the insulting he can. He will do all of the name calling he can and much more. And he'll turn his base against them. So DeSantis is having to play a very cautious game here. But the real game is there a way for Donald Trump, as I say, to basically get out of the way? The only way you can foresee that is if Trump actually realizes or thinks that he cannot win in 24 and not even win the nomination. The people at CPAC, of course, are very devoted conservatives, but are not necessarily completely representative of the Republican base. And that's one other thing we have to keep in mind when we see polls like this.
That's true, but I've got to say, Donald Trump has been incredibly successful in getting his endorsed candidates up. His track record there is quite astonishing. Now to President Biden and his foreign policy issues. I know you've written about this, and you've made the argument that after the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, the president has made an even more significant blunder in respect to China. Can you please explain that?
Well, yes, you see, the Afghan withdrawal of a year ago came back into the headlines really this week, didn't it, with the news of the droning of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda. A year ago, when the botched Afghan withdrawal occurred, you'll remember that President Biden said one of the reasons that it had occurred was because the main objectives of America in Afghanistan had been achieved, i.e. the removal of al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. Whatever you think about that, it is inexplicable, if al-Qaeda were not in Afghanistan, that 1 year later, the head of al-Qaeda was in Kabul, only meters away from the British and American embassies in Kabul. So there was a problem right there. Even Biden's victories remind you of American defeats. But the movement this week on the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's flight to Taiwan really was very interesting, because you can take all sorts of views about this. I happen to think, I'm no fan of Nancy Pelosi's, but I think she was quite right to go to Taiwan. I think it's intolerable that American officials should be told where they can and cannot fly by the Communist Party of China. So I think actually Nancy Pelosi did the right thing in visiting. But the White House has prevaricated over this issue in recent months. It's gone back and forth. And as a result, we really have seen a very dangerous thing. The Communist Party of China, as we saw from its response to Donald Trump, and as we've seen its response to different attitudes in Australia and different governments in Australia's attitudes towards China, we know that the Chinese Communist Party is very aware of when they are dealing with somebody who is strong, who is effectively immovable. And we know what they can do when they recognize that they have a contender who is effectively malleable. And in Joe Biden, the Communist Party of China appears to recognize, particularly on the issue of Taiwan, that they're dealing with essentially a malleable administration in DC. Now, I think for the future of the 21st century, and we've discussed this before, Rita, for the future of the 21st century, that is an exceptionally dangerous position for the world to be in. America, the world's leading democracy, the world's leading economy, cannot be seen to be able to be pushed around. Its decision-making, its policy-making, and indeed its officials' movements cannot be seen to be being pushed around by the communists in Beijing. So I very much hope that the Biden administration recognizes the scale of the Chinese challenge, recognizes the nature of the communist movement there, recognizes that it has to be extremely careful about giving Beijing even perceived victories. And so we'll see what comes from this. There's a lot of communist threats going on against America. And we'll just see whether the Chinese communists have as good a time pushing around the government of America and its officials as they have trying to push around Australian and British officials in recent decades.
Mm-hmm. You've given us plenty to think about there again, Douglas Murray. Thank you for joining me tonight.
It's a great pleasure as always. Thank you, Rita.